Proverbs 14:1 says this, "The fool says in his heart, there is no God." It's very easy to read past that section of Scripture and just simply assume that all we're talking about here is an atheist, and somebody who doesn't believe in God, and let's just keep moving to whatever's next. Except that if you actually stop and consider this verse, it has a little bit more and maybe even significantly more power than we realize, because this isn't talking about an atheist. This isn't talking about someone who doesn't believe in a God or has some rational reason for why God doesn't exist. This isn't an atheist. This is someone who actually recognizes and knows that there's a God, but says to his heart, believes in his heart, operates emotionally, practically, relationally, as though God doesn't exist. Unaware, unconcerned about the presence of God in his life. Well, that changes the conversation a little bit. In fact, I would want to dare say this, that too often all of us, we are unaware and unconcerned about the void of the presence of God in our lives. That God is present because he is omnipresent, that he is always everywhere, and yet we don't stop to consider where he is, what he's doing, how he's moving, that we practically don't operate as though he really does exist. In fact, several years ago, there was a term that was coined by researchers called practical atheists. And what they said is that the majority of American Christians operate as practical atheists. Meaning that, yes, they might attend religious services and they might have some cliche things that they say about spirituality and religion, and they might even have a few Bible verses memorized. But at the end of the day, the way that they operate, the way they relate to people, the way they engage politically, the way they do life is ultimately that of a practical atheist. Practically speaking, there's no evidence of God in their life. That's a terrifying thought. And yet, the research bears out that as American Christians, so many operate as practical atheists. Nate, I thought we were talking about Exodus. We are. We'll get there, I promise. We are wrapping up a series as we've worked our way through the book of Exodus. And obviously, we haven't not been able to hit on everything because I would love to have more time to unpack some of this. But we're going to wrap this up today because next week we're going to spend some time thinking about God's work in our global world and the strategic partnerships that we have. The following week, we have an opportunity to talk about celebrating you and so many of you that have invested so sacrificially over the last year or so. The next week, November 21, you all can prepare for this, whether you want to show up or not. But November 21, I get to talk to you about money. And we get to talk about generosity and where are you and thinking about that. And there's a specific number that I'm going to give you on that Sunday morning that is as sobering as any number that I've given you in a long time about the practical realities of how generosity works in our culture right now. We'll talk about that on the 21st. And then the 28th, some of you need to brace yourself. On the 28th, we start our Advent series. Like Christmas is coming. Christmas music is coming. Be advised. And some of you, that's awesome. And for some of you, you're already getting malcontent. But that's okay. We'll move on. That's just kind of sometimes the state of being for some of us. But we're working our way through this series, and what we've said is that God is telling a larger story, and he's invited us to play a role in it, and we have to understand that larger story, and that the Exodus, that God showing up in the midst of his people being oppressed, being enslaved for over 400 years, that he showed up and he gave them a rescue plan, and he rescued them because he wanted to reestablish his intimate relationship with them. And last week, we talked about the fact that they finally made it to the mountain. God calls Moses up to the mountain, and he gives them the law. And the law of God is handed down. And what we said last week is that that law was designed to be the way in which the relationship that God wanted to have with his people would be possible. That law outside of relationship is legalism. That the law outside of intimate connection with God has no benefit. In fact, it's destructive. But God never gave law outside of relationship. He gave law in the context of relationship. And because they were his people, he said, here's how I want you to relate to me. Here's how we can, a holy God and an unholy people, how we can relate together based on this law that he laid out. And that the law was given only after he said, reminded them, I am the God who brought you out of Egypt. I am the one who rescued you. Now here's the relationship that I want to have with you. As I was sharing with Ben and Anthony as we were kind of putting this series together, I said we could stop there and we could say the rest of Exodus is really just the explanation, the further development of those 613 laws that were given as part of the Mosaic covenant, and that's fine. But I said the truth is, there's one more message I really want us to preach in this series. And it's actually my favorite message in the series. It's actually my favorite encounter that anyone has with God in all of Scripture. It is my single favorite encounter that anybody has with God in all of Scripture. So I want to preach that because I think it's so important that we capture that as part of this series. And so we're going to dive into that, and I want to introduce you to that interaction that I think is so incredibly helpful and, quite frankly, deeply convicting for us as we think about what it means for us in the American church to be practical atheists and the opportunity that was given to the Israelites to experience the exact same. Walk with me if you would. Exodus 24, we kind of see kind of the people's response to the law. So God calls Moses up and the law is being given. And here's what we read in Exodus 24, verses 3 and 4. When Moses went and told the people all the Lord's words and laws, they responded with one voice. Everything the Lord has said, we will do. Moses then wrote everything down the Lord had said. The people's response to hearing the law: we will do everything that the Lord has said to do. Well, let's just wait and see what happens with that. Exodus 32, we read this. When the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, he was up there for about 40 days, they gathered around Aaron and said, come make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses, the one who had brought them out of Egypt, as for this fellow Moses, who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him. He might as well be dead. He's been gone for 40 days. He went up to the mountain to meet with God. We haven't heard from him. He's gone. Aaron answered them, take off the gold earrings that your wives, your sons, and your daughters are wearing and bring them to me. So all the people took off their earrings and brought them to Aaron. He took what they had handed him and made it into an idol cast in the shape of a calf, fashioning it with a tool. Then they said, these are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. Moses is up there for 40 days. The people get impetuous. We saw this over and over again already. They come to Aaron. Hey, we don't know what happened to Moses. He apparently has abandoned us. We need something to worship. And so Aaron helps them by taking all of the gold that they had plundered from Egypt. They put it together and they form it into a form of a calf, and then they begin to worship it, saying, this is representative of the gods that brought us up out of Egypt. We will do everything the Lord has told us to do. We will worship another God because he didn't act quick enough for our behalf. This isn't really part of the message, so you can ignore this if you want, but I'm just going to invite you to consider something with me, right? So again, this isn't part of the message, so you can ignore this if you want, but I'm just going to say this. The commitments that we make are at the mercy of our unmanaged appetites. So many of us make commitments. We're going to do this differently. We're going to show up here. We're going to be this kind of a person. But because we don't manage the appetites in our life, the things that we want so badly in the here and now, because we don't manage them, we sacrifice, we sabotage our commitments. Which is why, by the way, if you're not married, hear me on this one. If you're looking towards marriage, nobody can promise their way beyond their past. Meaning they don't get to stand up in a church service or in some sort of a setting and say, I promise to be devoted to you and to be faithful to you, when their past is littered with examples that they weren't, without recognition that something needed to change. You can't promise your way past your past. What you can do is make changes. What you can do is allow the Spirit of God to transform you, but you cannot promise your way out of your past. The commitments that we make will be sabotaged by our unmanaged appetites. And the people were committed. They were committed. They were devoted to honoring Yahweh, who had brought them up out of Egypt. We will do everything he has commanded them to do. And then for 40 days, they sat twiddling their thumbs. They got impetuous, and they started worshiping a golden calf. Can we just recognize this? Make whatever resolution, whatever commitment, make whatever promise that you want. If you don't manage your unmanaged appetites, you'll sabotage it. Many of us have experienced that time and again and again and again. Okay, let me go back to the message. That wasn't part of it. Sorry. Here we go. Exodus 33:7, we get this really interesting anecdote about how Moses and God relate to each other. Exodus 33:7. Now Moses used to take a tent and pitch it outside of the camp, some distance away, calling it the tent of meeting. It's a very specific tent that Moses set up where God would somehow meet with Moses and the people. Anyone inquiring of the Lord would go to the tent of meeting outside of the camp. Whenever the people saw the pillar of cloud, again, representative of God's presence, standing at the entrance of the tent, they all stood and worshiped, each at the entrance of their own tent. But then Moses would be the one to enter in. And we're told this, that the Lord at that tent, inside that tent, would speak to Moses face to face as one speaks to a friend. That there was this encounter that Moses had with God as he would inquire of God and ask questions of God, and they would have conversations. And we've seen God get angry, right? We've seen some of these tough interactions that Moses had, and it would happen oftentimes in this tent of meeting where they would join with one another, and there would be intimate fellowship, oftentimes very spirited fellowship. And it's in that setting that God gives Moses an offer, and the offer that he gives Moses is what I am so intrigued by. Verse 1 of chapter 33, we're told this. Then the Lord said to Moses, he's going to make him an offer and he's going to make him a promise. Leave this place, you and the people you brought you out of Egypt, and go up to the land I promised an oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants. I will send an angel before you and drive out the Canaanites, the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Go up to the land flowing with milk and honey. He says to Moses in this intimate fellowship, Moses, I'm going to fulfill my promise. I promised Abraham the promised land. I want you to go take it. I'm going to send my angel before you. I'm going to give you victory over all of these different nations, all of these different groups of people. I'm going to give you what I promised you. Moses, get ready. I promised it to you, and now I'm going to fulfill that promise to you. But that's not the most interesting part of the encounter. And before I get to the rest of the encounter, I want you to take a look at a video that kind of catches us to speed as to where we are and where this whole conversation fits in God's redemptive plan. Take a look.
From darkness to light, this is the story we all share as the people of God. He draws us out to draw us in. From the birth of Israel to the church today, God delivers and dwells with his people. This story began several thousand years ago, and it began with a promise from God to Abraham that he would make his offspring more numerous than the stars in the sky, a great nation who would one day dwell in the promised land. More than 400 years passed, and Abraham's descendants had not seen this promise fulfilled. Instead, the Israelites lived as foreigners in the land of Egypt. Fearing that the Hebrews would grow into a mighty nation and overtake them, the Pharaoh of Egypt forced them to work as slaves. But Israel continued to grow. In response, the Egyptians increased their oppression of God's people, and Pharaoh gave a terrible decree. Every son born to the Hebrews would be thrown into the river. But a Levite couple defied this order, trusting God's will for their son's life. And God did have a plan for this child, Pharaoh's daughter found the baby and took pity on him. She named him Moses because he was drawn out of the water. As Moses grew older and saw the suffering of his people, anger burned within him. When he witnessed an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, Moses killed the man and fled Egypt to hide in the desert. Years passed, and Moses made a new life for himself in Midian. Then one day the voice of the Lord called out to him from a burning bush. God told Moses that he saw the persecution of his people in Egypt, and he heard their cries. He promised to deliver the Israelites from slavery, and he commanded Moses to go before Pharaoh on their behalf. Moses was terrified, so God sent Moses' brother Aaron to go with him. The brothers went before Pharaoh, performing signs and wonders, but Pharaoh would not listen, so God brought down plagues upon Egypt. Yet Pharaoh's heart remained hard as stone. To prepare for the 10th and final plague, the Hebrews marked their doors with the blood of spotless lambs. That night, the angel of death passed through the kingdom, killing the firstborn child of every Egyptian household that did not bear the mark, including Pharaoh's. Heartbroken, Pharaoh told the Israelites to go. They were finally set free, and the Spirit of God led the people out and toward the promised land. But Pharaoh's grief soon turned to rage. He changed his mind and then commanded the Egyptian army to pursue them. When the Israelites came to the Red Sea, Moses lifted his staff to the sky and the waters parted. The Hebrews passed through the towering waves, and the Egyptians were swallowed by the sea. The Israelites found themselves in a harsh wilderness. Though they had just witnessed God's power and might in rescuing them, the people doubted their deliverer would provide, and instead complained of hunger and thirst. A few days later, they found manna on the ground, sweet and good to eat. And the Lord told Moses to strike a rock with his staff, giving them water to drink. The Lord had provided yet again. As the Israelites approached Mount Sinai, Moses delivered a word from God. If they obeyed and kept God's covenant, God would make them his treasured possession, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And the people promised to do so. 3 days later, the mountain shook as a sound like a trumpet grew louder and louder. Then the Lord came down in fire and smoke. When the people heard God's voice, they grew afraid, and they asked Moses to speak with God on their behalf. God gave Moses many laws and instructions, including the 10 Commandments. And the Hebrews promised to worship the Lord alone and to keep his laws. Moses spent 40 days and nights on the mountain with God and returned to find the people bowing down to an idol. They had forgotten their promise. Moses burned the idols and atoned for the people's sin. And though God punished the Israelites, he did not destroy them completely. After the Israelites repented of their unfaithfulness, they went to work making everything that the Lord had instructed. They sewed fine garments for Aaron and his sons and consecrated them with oil for their service as priests. They built the Ark of the Covenant to hold the tablets of the law, and also built the tabernacle where God would dwell with his people. Yahweh, the one who drew them out of slavery. And though the Israelites would endure more strife and hardship, they continued on in hope toward the promised land. The story of Israel is the story of us today. We are God's people. He draws us out to draw us in. And like the Israelites, we still await the promised land in the midst of our sin and suffering. Yet God is with us.
Then the Lord said to Moses, "Leave this place, you and the people you brought out of Egypt, and go to the land that I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants. I will send an angel before you and drive out the Canaanites, Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. Go up to the land flowing with milk and honey. But there's a condition. Here's God's condition. I will not go with you. Because you are a stiff-necked people, and I might destroy you on the way. That's kind of honest, isn't it? When the people heard these distressing words, they began to mourn, and no one put on any garments. For the Lord had said to Moses, tell the Israelites, you are a stiff-necked people. If I were to go with you, even for a moment, I might destroy you. Here's the deal that God made with Moses. I'm going to fulfill my promise to you. I'm going to give you victory in the land. I am going to give you prosperity. You can have it all. I will send my angel ahead to give you victory, to give you prosperity. But here's the deal. I'm not coming with you. You're a bunch of stiff-necked people. You're ungrateful. You're rebellious. You're defiant. And I might very well consume you because I'm so angry with your people, Moses. That's an interesting deal, isn't it? You can have all of my stuff. You can have all of my promises. You can have all of the things that you so desperately long for in life. You just can't have me, Moses. That's a pretty interesting deal. Can I be honest with you? This is why this interaction is so interesting to me. We look at it in the scope of history and we say, that's ridiculous. God wasn't really going to do that, was he? Can I just put it into the here and now? Can I ask us to consider something for a minute? It's a deal that so many of us would have taken. It's a deal that many of us have taken. It's a deal that the American church has taken. The American church in so many ways have said, God, we want your blessing, we want your affluence, we want your protection, but truly, honestly, whether you're with us or not, we're okay, because we can kind of do it without you. See, here's a question. Here's literally a question that keeps me up at night. This is a question that I wrestle with on a regular basis. This is a question that creates maybe as much anxiety for me in a ministry context as anything else that I deal with. Here's the question. If God withdrew his power and his presence from SBC, would we notice and would we do anything differently than we're currently doing it? Hear me. Would we show up for religious services? Would we still just run programming? Would we still relate to each other the same way? Does God's presence and his power in our midst actually change anything? That's a question that I wrestle with. I've been here 24 years. I've been here 24 years. And it haunts me. Because I know that God is omnipresent. I know he's everywhere at all times. But is his power and his presence directly connected to what we're doing and why we're doing it? Is it directly connected to me as a husband, to me as a father, to me as a pastor? Is it directly tied to how and why we do the things that we do in our community? If God wasn't here, would it change anything? It's a scary, scary proposition. And I think it's one that so many people take on a regular basis. We are unaware and unconcerned about the void of God's presence in an active, engaged state, our lack of intimacy, our lack of awareness. We're unaware and unengaged and unconcerned. Our fear of the future, or our fear of the unknown, our fear of the political landscape, the financial challenges that we experience, the way that we manage the wealth and the affluence that we have at our disposal, the way we think about the wealth that we have, our affluence, in the successes that we experience. Did we get it or are we giving it? The marital challenges that we face. How we respond to somebody who's hurt us or betrayed us. The parenting challenges. Our career aspirations, why we pursue the things that we do. The way that we respond to suffering, emotional, physical, relational suffering. How we engage in political debate and discussion. How we determine our response to people that we perceive as threats and maybe even as enemies. Are we aware and concerned about what God thinks about those things and his presence and his power in the midst of those things? Because if I'm honest, many of us are not. And we live life as, say it with me, practical atheists. I actually said it. That wasn't hypothetical. That wasn't rhetorical. Say it with me. We live life as practical atheists. Again, this isn't everybody, right? And I'm not trying to cast any kind of dispersions on anybody. All I'm saying is this: we have to be more aware of the fact that we are oftentimes unaware and unconcerned about God's presence and his power in our lives and how we move in a direction as a result. In fact, I'm going to say it this way. One of the most illogical realities of Americanized Christianity is its inclination to operate independent of the power and presence of God. That's reality. We can fill buildings, we can run massive programs, we can have political influence, we can do a whole lot of stuff. Guess what? We can do it all without God. We can do it all without him. We have done it without him. The Americanized version of Christianity too often is oriented away from where is God in this? Where is he moving? What does he want from me? What is his desire for us and how we do life? So I'm intrigued by Moses' response because it's a deal that, again, many of us would take. And I think it's a deal that many of us kind of take on a daily basis. I'll give you my stuff, but you're not getting me. When the people heard these distressing words, they began to mourn, we're told. Verse 12 of Exodus 33. Moses said to the Lord, "You have been telling me lead these people." By the way, one of my favorite moments for Moses here. He says to God, who told him, "You can go ahead, I'm going to give you a victory, I'm going to give you the land, but I ain't coming with you." God would have spoken proper English. Oh, wait a minute, he wouldn't have. We'll leave that one alone. Because English is the only language that we know. That's a different message. I'm sorry. Moses said to the Lord, "You have been telling me lead these people, but you have not let me know whom you will send with me. Now that you're pulling back, you have said, I know you by name, and you have found favor with me." God, you've said that you know me, that you are my God, that you have given me your personal name, Yahweh. You've told me that you know me and that I can call you by name, that I've been found with favor with you. If you are pleased with me, teach me your ways so that I may know you and continue to find favor with you. Remember that this nation is your people. You're telling me to lead these people. You've told me I've found favor with you. These are your people. God, what in the world are you talking about? When Moses said this to him, "If your presence does not go with us, do not send us up from here." Moses says, we don't want the land if we can't have you. We don't want your blessing. We don't want your power. We don't want your affluence. We don't want it if we can't have you. If your presence does not go with us, do not send us up from here. How will anyone know that you are pleased with me and with your people unless you go with us? I love this because he said, the victories, the successes are not going to be evidence of your connection with us. Don't miss this. We live in a world right now. If people are successful, it must be God's blessings on them. If people are successful, God must be blessing them. Moses goes, here's the deal. We can have all those victories. The people aren't going to know it's you. Moses calls out 21st Americanized Christianity right here, 21st century Americanized Christianity right here. Success ain't enough. If your presence does not go with us, do not send us up from here. How will anyone know that you are pleased with me and with your people unless you go with us? what else will distinguish me? If I don't have your power and your presence, how else am I going to be distinguished and your people from all the other people on the face of the earth? We go get successes, we go get victories, we go take the land. Congratulations, we got it, but we look like everybody else who's militaristically gone in and conquered something. Our military prowess and successes do not determine God's blessing and his presence. Boy, we got to wrestle with that. Moses literally is just completely imploding so much of what we think of when we think of God's power being with us and for us. He's saying the successes are not enough. The victories are not enough. How are we going to be any different than anybody else if you're not with us? Moses, God's response. The Lord replied, my presence will go with you, and I will give you rest. And the Lord said to Moses, I will do the very thing you have asked because I am pleased with you, and I know you by name. Moses, that's the right answer. Moses, that's what I want from you. Moses, I want you to understand that just having success and me just giving you what I've promised isn't the same as me being present with you and you being my people, a distinguished group of people who are priests, a kingdom of priests for my glory. See, here's the thing that I think we got to grapple with. Christianity isn't about coming to God to get his stuff. It's about coming to God to get him. Is he enough or not? Is he, I'm going to be a jerk. Like, this is like you invite this. You show up every week for this. I got to be a jerk. Like, literally, I'm sorry. And some of you can get really angry with me. We don't come to get God to get his stuff. We come to get him. And then we suffer, and God takes away our health, or he takes away our financial affluence, or he takes away our relational successes, or he takes away our career successes, or he just allows us to suffer just a little bit compared to the rest of the world. And we go, where are you, God? I'm not sure I can trust a God who will allow me to experience this. I'm not sure you're still good. I love you. I love you. And we don't really think that we do this, but too often, the way that Americanized Christians suffer, awful, pathetic way in which we suffer, showcases that we don't get this. We think we come to God to get him to give us everything that we want, to give us health, to give us financial whatever. And that if God is present, those things are going to be there for us. And when we struggle, we start asking questions about his character and his goodness. I'll move on. I know I'm a jerk. I'm sorry. I can only be that for so long. Here we go. Moses pushes for more. I love this. This encounter, Moses is like, okay, you're going to go with us. You're going to give us your presence. Okay, God, I don't want just that. I want more. Let's check this out. Verse 18. Then Moses said, now show me your glory. And the Lord said, I will cause all my goodness to pass in front of you, and I will proclaim my name, the Lord, in your presence. I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. But he said, you cannot see my face, for no one may see me and live. You were meeting with me in the tent of meeting face to face as one meets with a friend. And God goes, here's the deal. You don't even understand how limited what you're experiencing of my power and my presence actually is. Because if you actually saw the full bore of my power and my presence, you would die. So God says, here's the deal. I can give you part of this, but I can't give you everything you're asking for because you don't even know what you're asking for, because you don't realize how powerful I am. Exodus 34, 5-7. Then the Lord came down in the cloud and stood there with him and proclaimed his name, the Lord. And he passed in front of Moses, proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children of their children for the sin of the parents to the third and the fourth generation. God declares this about himself: I am compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, as he's proven now over and over again, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. And then that last section, the third and fourth generation punishment, later on, he actually rescinds that. He rescinds that declaration in the prophets and says, no longer will that be the case. So we're left with, yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. And ultimately, because of Christ. Now, I've only got a few minutes to do this, but I can't say we're terrible at this. Americanized Christianity doesn't do this very well. We all have to wrestle with this reality. I can't do the negative without inviting you into the positive. So I got to take a couple of minutes and just ask you to consider this simple question. How do you practice the presence of God in your life? How do you do it? I just want to take a couple of minutes to wrestle with this because I think there's some practical things I want us to consider together. What is practicing the presence of God? Meeting God in everyday life, aware of being in his presence at all times. I become acutely aware that God is always present, no matter whether I realize it or not. Growing and being aware of and responding to his presence. Increasingly being consciously present when I am in the presence of God. Responding to God's omnipresence in our world. God is present everywhere, whether we recognize it or not. He is present, and he has revealed himself, and he continues to reveal himself in practical ways in our daily, everyday lives. So here's just a few ideas. How do I practice the presence of God? Yesterday, for many of you, was a Saturday where a bunch of mundane tasks and chores were being done. How do you consider how to practice the presence of God in that? When I'm doing mundane tasks, especially as a parent who's going, why can't my kids help with this more? Maybe that's just me. I'm sorry, I'll move on. The privilege that I get to serve. How many of us think about everyday tasks as just a privilege that I get to serve other people? Rather than the resentments and the frustrations, but I get to serve how? I get to serve like God serves me in ways that I don't even get to see or understand. Practicing the presence of God, I am privileged to serve because I recognize I have a God who serves. And developing what's called the habit of happiness. That I can just become happy in everyday experiences and everyday chores because I cultivate that happiness and I think about God's presence in the midst of that and I find joy in doing that. I don't just find happiness when I get to go on vacation. People. Man, when I encounter people, especially people that are hard to love, difficult people, do I find myself celebrating our differences, that God did not make us all the same? Thank the Lord. If I had a church full of people like me, I would have left a long time ago. Celebrating differences, offering unreturned love. Why? Because that's the model of love that we've been given, to give love to those who cannot and will not offer it back. Protecting others, even from themselves. Not playing by the same rules. That's practicing the presence of God in the body that I have. My ability to move. The older we get, the more limited we become, the less movement there is. My ability to move. Amazement at the faculties that God has given me. God's intentionality with how he designed me. The creation, as I experience it with his creativity, its beauty, and it's the uniqueness that he offers us. The worries and the regrets that I experience. Learning how to practice trust. Learning how to surrender control because I can trust the one who is in control. Reflecting on Scripture, God revealing himself through Scripture, and then identifying who I am and what is true about me in light of who God is. Watching the news or reading the news reports. How do I practice the presence of God in that rather than just getting angry or irritated? I recognize that it's not the end. If it's not good, it's not the end, right? If there's going to be a victory, because I know the end of the story, because God is good and he will redeem all. If it's not good, it's not the end. So there's more to the story. Hopeful worship in the midst of the struggle, because that's what Christians are uniquely able to experience. To have a larger perspective that goes beyond just this moment in time and see a bigger plan of God. God's global plan in the world. I think so often we become so myopic, limited in our scope, and we don't see what God's doing in the rest of the world. And when you see reports and you intentionally engage in the reports of what God is doing around the world, it tells us this: the same God who is working in Iran, who is multiplying his church in some of the most dark areas of our world, is still working here. Just taking an opportunity to consider what he's doing globally, and he's still working here. And then life disruptions. We get disruptions every day. Life never plays out. Your day does not go the way expected. What do you do with disruptions? You see them either as annoyances to be avoided, to be pushed off, or you see them what? As divine encounters, as an opportunity to be reminded that my agenda is not the most important thing. That my list for today is not the most important thing, and that God may have other things for me to focus my time and attention on. Practicing the presence of God. So where do we see the gospel in this? This is where I want to land. We see the gospel in it this way. At the end of the day, we all took the deal. We wanted the good, we want the affluence, we want the success, but at the end of the day, Scripture seems to indicate we all kind of took the deal that says we want God's stuff, but we don't want him. Which is why Paul says this in Romans 5. You see, at just the right time, when we were still powerless, God died for the ungodly. Very rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, though for a good person, someone might possibly dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, while we had no will and no way back to God, while we were actively in rebellion against him. And I still believe church history seems to indicate this. I believe that Saul who became Paul, who is now identified as Paul, when Paul wrote this, Paul is writing from a personal encounter, because it's very likely that Paul was in Jerusalem when Jesus was being crucified, which means it's very likely that Paul was writing this saying, I looked into his eyes, I saw him hanging on that cross, and I realized that he was hanging on that cross for me, who was actively in rebellion against him, trying to snuff him out and cheerleading the very thing that was happening in that moment. But God demonstrates his own love for us in this, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. We took the deal, and he said, that's not good enough for me. We took the deal, and God said, yeah, I got a different plan. Which means this, that Christ was and is willing to join with us even when we were completely uninterested in being with him. That even when we were not interested in being with him, he joined with us. And those of us, those that we love, that we hear about in the world that we are, those that continue to have no interest, he wants to enter in and be with them as well. 3 things I want us to consider, and then we'll close out with song. First question: if you were honest, in what ways do you function as a practical atheist? Just be honest. Not every day, not in every area, but where do you function like that? Unaware and unconcerned about the power and presence of God in your life. I think for many of us, it's politically. For some of us, it's parenting. For some of us, it's our money. For some of us, it's in our marriage. For some of us, it's when we get wounded by another person. In what area do you operate as a practical atheist? Second one, in what area of your life are you the most aware of God's presence and are dependent on his power? In what area of your life? Because again, we're not all one thing, right? This is not some polarized, we're this or we're that. We're all kind of some combination of really, really weird and screwed up and really beautiful. At least most of us are. Where is it that you are the most aware of God's presence and dependent on his power? And then the last one. Because if we can understand how we are dependent on it and what areas we are, then we have the ability to take that and leverage that into other areas what areas of your life do you need to cultivate a greater awareness and dependence on God's presence and on his power? Where do you need to become more aware? Where do you need to slow down and ask, God, where are you present in the midst of this? How do I need to rely on your power more in the way I react to this and how I think about this? Where are you operating as a practical atheist? Where are you doing it well? Where do you need to become more in tune so that we can be people who practice the presence of God because we recognize what's at stake? Because if we are not aware and not concerned about his presence in our lives, then we'll take a deal that so many have taken, and the catastrophic consequences we're seeing play themselves out. We want to be a part of something different. We want to be part of a larger story. And we have the privilege of having this book that's been passed down for thousands of years given to us so that we can see this provocative story, this incredible encounter where Moses says, we're not moving without you. Because it's only through you being present with us that any of this makes any sense at all. Would you stand together, please?